The biochemical weapon was spreading through the base, and soldiers were collapsing faster than anyone could treat them. Their top scientists couldn't identify the agent, let alone create an antidote. Then Dr. Sarah Kim, the field hospital doctor they barely noticed, said quietly, "I know what this is, and I know how to stop it." What they discovered about her classified past explained why she'd been treating wounded soldiers instead of designing weapons. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing for more tales of unrecognized heroes. The field hospital at Forward Operating Base Damascus hummed with its usual controlled chaos as Dr. Sarah Kim sutured a shrapnel wound on Corporal Martinez's shoulder. At 0730 hours, she moved between patients with the efficient precision that had characterized her work for the past 5 years, treating everything from minor cuts to life-threatening combat injuries with equal professional dedication. Sarah's medical station occupied a corner of the main treatment facility, where she had processed over 3,000 wounded soldiers since her deployment began. Her colleagues knew her as a competent trauma physician who worked long hours without complaint, rarely socializing beyond professional interactions, and maintained the kind of focused dedication that kept people alive in war zones. At 34, Sarah had built a reputation based on clinical excellence rather than personal charisma. She arrived early, stayed late, and approached every medical challenge with methodical problem-solving that had earned respect from both patients and fellow medical personnel. Her background indicated completion of residency training at Johns Hopkins, followed by specialized trauma surgery education that had prepared her for battlefield medicine. But Sarah's personnel file told only part of her story. Missing were the details about her previous career in biochemical research, her classified work with government defense contractors, and the specific expertise that had led her to seek the healing environment of military medicine after years of developing weapons designed to kill rather than cure. As she completed Martinez's sutures and moved to her next patient, Sarah noticed increased activity around the base perimeter. Radio traffic was more intense than usual, and security personnel were implementing protocols that suggested something beyond routine threat assessment was developing. Doc Kim called Staff Sergeant Angela Torres, the senior medic responsible for coordinating treatment priorities. "We're getting reports of some kind of incident at the chemical storage facility. Might need to prep for multiple casualties." Sarah nodded acknowledgement while continuing her patient care. Though the mention of chemical incidents triggered analytical thinking she had spent 5 years trying to suppress. Her previous career had required comprehensive understanding of chemical agents, their effects on human physiology, and the complex relationships between molecular structure and biological impact. The first casualties arrived at 0847 hours. Private First Class David Chen was carried into the treatment facility by 2 soldiers wearing hastily donned protective gear, his condition unlike anything Sarah had encountered in 5 years of trauma medicine. Chen was conscious but experiencing severe respiratory distress, neurological symptoms that included tremors and disorientation, and skin discoloration that indicated systemic toxicity. "What happened?" Sarah asked as she began initial assessment, her medical training automatically cataloging symptoms while another part of her mind was already analyzing the presentation through expertise she had hoped never to use again. "Chemical leak at the storage facility," replied Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, one of Chen's carriers. "Started with weird smells, then people started collapsing. We've got maybe 12 more casualties coming in." Sarah's assessment of Chen's condition revealed symptom patterns that triggered memories from her previous career. The specific combination of respiratory, neurological, and dermatological effects suggested exposure to organophosphate compounds, but with modifications that indicated sophisticated development rather than industrial accident. "Sergeant Torres," Sarah called, "we need to implement chemical exposure protocols immediately. Full protective equipment for all medical personnel, and prepare for mass casualty processing." As additional casualties arrived, the pattern became clearer and more disturbing. Each patient presented with similar symptoms but at different stages of progression, suggesting ongoing exposure to an agent that was both persistent and designed to cause maximum physiological disruption. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Harrison, the base medical officer, arrived at the field hospital as the number of casualties reached 15. His expression showed the strain of someone dealing with an unprecedented medical emergency that exceeded standard treatment protocols. "Dr. Kim, what's your assessment?" Harrison asked, studying the organized chaos of medical personnel treating patients with unknown chemical exposure. "Sir, we're dealing with a sophisticated chemical agent that appears to be a modified organophosphate compound," Sarah replied, choosing her words carefully to provide accurate information without revealing the depth of her analytical capabilities. "Standard atropine protocols are providing minimal improvement." Harrison studied the patient data that Sarah had compiled, recognizing expertise that exceeded standard trauma medicine training. "Doctor, how are you able to identify the specific agent class so quickly?" The question touched on knowledge that Sarah had deliberately concealed for 5 years, but the worsening condition of her patients made continued evasion impossible. 15 soldiers were dying from exposure to a chemical agent that she suspected was not accidental, and their survival might depend on expertise she had tried to abandon. "Sir, I have some background in biochemical analysis," Sarah replied carefully. "These symptoms suggest exposure to a weaponized organophosphate compound that has been modified to increase persistence and resist standard countermeasures." Harrison's expression shifted as he recognized implications that extended beyond medical treatment. "Dr. Kim, are you suggesting this was an intentional chemical attack?" Before Sarah could respond, the base alarm system activated with the distinctive pattern that indicated chemical warfare threats. Over the loudspeaker, Colonel Patricia Wade's voice provided confirmation of everyone's worst fears. "All personnel, this is Base Command. We are under chemical attack. Implement MOP4 protective posture immediately. This is not a drill." The field hospital erupted into controlled emergency protocols as medical personnel donned chemical protective equipment while continuing to treat patients whose conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Sarah worked through the chaos with focused efficiency, but her mind was calculating variables that went far beyond standard medical training. "Dr. Kim," Harrison said, approaching her station while struggling with his protective mask, "I need your honest assessment. What are we dealing with, and how do we treat it?" Sarah looked around the treatment facility where soldiers were dying from exposure to a chemical agent that conventional medicine couldn't effectively counter. The symptoms were progressing exactly as she would have predicted based on her previous work, but saying so would require revealing knowledge she had spent 5 years trying to forget. "Sir, this appears to be a binary organophosphate agent with delayed activation properties," Sarah said, committing to a level of technical detail that would require explanation. "The initial exposure causes mild symptoms, but secondary reactions create the severe manifestations we're seeing." Harrison stared at Sarah through his mask's visor. "Doctor, that level of analysis suggests expertise beyond standard medical training. What's your background in chemical warfare agents?" The question hung in the air like the chemical contamination that was spreading through the base. Sarah had reached the moment she had hoped never to face, the point where saving lives would require acknowledging the work that had led her to seek redemption through military medicine. "Sir, I need to speak with you privately," Sarah said, gesturing toward a treatment area that offered minimal privacy within the bustling medical facility. Harrison followed Sarah to a corner of the hospital where they could speak without being overheard by other medical personnel who were struggling to treat patients with an agent that seemed to resist all conventional countermeasures. "Colonel Harrison," Sarah began, knowing that her next words would fundamentally change her relationship with the military medical community. "Before joining the Army Medical Corps, I worked for defense contractors developing chemical weapons and countermeasures." The revelation hit Harrison with the force of physical impact. He stared at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time, trying to reconcile the trauma physician he had worked with for 5 years with someone claiming expertise in weapons development. "Dr. Kim, are you saying you've designed chemical weapons similar to what we're facing?" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of past decisions that had led her to seek the healing environment of military medicine. "Sir, I was part of a classified program that developed binary organophosphate compounds for military applications.
What's affecting our soldiers appears to be based on research I was involved in. Harrison's expression showed shock, but also recognition of opportunity. Doctor, can you develop an effective treatment? Yes, sir, I believe I can, Sarah replied, but I'll need access to the base laboratory and chemical supplies that may not be available through standard medical channels. Harrison made a command decision that would be reviewed and questioned for months afterward, but felt absolutely necessary given the circumstances. Dr. Kim, I'm authorizing you full access to base chemical facilities. What do you need? Sarah felt familiar analytical thinking beginning to dominate her consciousness as she transitioned from trauma physician to biochemical weapons specialist. Sir, I need samples of the contaminating agent, access to the base chemistry laboratory, and approximately 2 hours to synthesize an effective antidote. You have it, Harrison replied, but Dr. Kim, after this crisis is resolved, we're going to have a comprehensive discussion about your background. Sarah nodded, understanding, knowing that her carefully constructed medical career would be forever altered by the day's revelations. But 17 soldiers were dying from exposure to chemical agents that she had helped design, and their survival required her to embrace knowledge she had spent 5 years trying to suppress. Within 30 minutes, Sarah was working in the base chemistry laboratory with equipment and materials that she hadn't used since leaving her previous career. Her hands moved over molecular analysis instruments with muscle memory that hadn't diminished despite years of focusing on healing rather than weapons development. The chemical agent samples confirmed her worst suspicions. The compound was indeed based on research she had conducted, but with modifications that suggested the involvement of someone with access to classified development programs. This wasn't terrorism conducted by foreign agents. This was an attack using American-developed weapons technology. Sarah began synthesizing countermeasures using knowledge that she had hoped never to apply again. The antidote required precise molecular engineering that combined her understanding of the original weapon design with her medical knowledge of human physiology and toxicology. As she worked, memories flooded back from her previous career. Laboratory environments focused on lethality rather than healing, classified briefings about weapons designed to cause maximum casualties, and the gradual realization that her expertise was being used to develop tools of mass destruction rather than national defense. The moral weight of her previous work had eventually become unbearable, leading her to abandon a lucrative career in biochemical research and seek redemption through military medicine. For 5 years she had saved lives instead of ending them, finding satisfaction in healing that had partially offset the knowledge that her research had contributed to weapons designed to kill. But now soldiers were dying from exposure to agents based on her research, and the only way to save them was to embrace the knowledge she had tried to abandon. 2 hours and 37 minutes after beginning her work, Sarah had synthesized an antidote that would neutralize the specific chemical agent affecting base personnel. The compound was designed to counteract both the primary toxicity and the delayed secondary reactions that made the weapon so deadly. Colonel Harrison, Sarah radioed from the laboratory, I have an effective antidote ready for administration. Begin treatment immediately with the 17 most critical patients. The antidote worked exactly as Sarah had calculated. Within hours, soldiers who had been dying from chemical exposure began showing dramatic improvement. The weapon that had seemed unstoppable was neutralized by countermeasures designed by someone who understood both its mechanism of action and its intended effects on human physiology. As the immediate medical crisis resolved and base security investigated the source of the chemical attack, Sarah found herself facing questions about her background that she had hoped never to answer in military settings. Colonel Wade arrived at the field hospital as the last of the chemical exposure patients was declared stable. Her expression showed relief at the medical success combined with obvious concerns about the security implications of the attack and Sarah's unexpected expertise. Dr. Kim, Wade said, approaching Sarah's medical station where she was completing patient monitoring protocols, I understand your expertise was critical in resolving this crisis. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied, though her tone carried the same measured professionalism that had characterized her medical work rather than satisfaction typically associated with successful weapons development. Wade studied Sarah with new understanding. Doctor, I've been briefed on your background. I need to know if there are other individuals with access to the research you were involved in who might pose similar threats. The question touched on the darkest aspects of Sarah's previous career, the realization that biochemical weapons research attracted individuals whose motivations weren't always aligned with national security interests. Ma'am, the program I was involved in was highly classified with limited personnel access, Sarah explained, but any former team member would have the knowledge necessary to synthesize similar agents. Wade's expression showed calculation as she processed the security implications. Dr. Kim, I'm going to need you to work with our intelligence personnel to identify potential threats and develop comprehensive countermeasures. The request represented a return to the world of weapons development that Sarah had deliberately left behind, but circumstances had made her expertise essential for protecting American soldiers from threats based on her own research. Ma'am, I'm willing to provide consultation on defensive measures, Sarah agreed, but I want to maintain my primary assignment to medical operations. Wade nodded with understanding that suggested familiarity with personnel who had complex relationships with their specialized knowledge. Doctor, your medical work saved 17 lives today, but your weapons expertise may be necessary to prevent future attacks. As the day concluded and the base returned to normal operations with enhanced chemical security protocols, Sarah reflected on the transition from trauma physician to biochemical weapons consultant that circumstances had forced upon her. For 5 years, she had successfully separated herself from weapons development, finding redemption through military medicine that had allowed her to save lives rather than destroy them. But the chemical attack had demonstrated that her past expertise remained relevant when American soldiers faced threats based on her own research. 3 months later, Sarah had developed comprehensive chemical warfare countermeasures that were implemented across multiple military installations. Her work had prevented additional attacks while maintaining her primary commitment to medical operations that continued to save lives through healing rather than weapons development. Sometimes, Sarah reflected as she treated a soldier wounded in conventional combat operations, redemption doesn't come from abandoning your past. It comes from using that past to protect others from the dangers you helped create. The field hospital continued its mission of healing wounded soldiers, but everyone now knew that Dr. Sarah Kim possessed expertise that extended far beyond trauma medicine. Her transition from weapons developer to military physician had been motivated by moral concerns about her research, but those same moral concerns had ultimately required her to embrace her past knowledge when soldiers' lives depended on it. Sarah had proven that expertise could be redirected toward protection rather than destruction, and that sometimes the most effective defense against sophisticated threats came from those who understood how such threats were designed and deployed. The weapons developer who had become a healer had used both skill sets to save lives when circumstances demanded comprehensive solutions. The base laboratory where she had synthesized life-saving antidotes served as evidence that knowledge, once acquired, could be applied to different purposes when duty demanded its use. And 17 soldiers were alive because someone had been willing to embrace a past she had tried to forget in order to protect people she had sworn to heal.